Greg, thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs. I have huge respect for your work, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm curious to know, what was it that sort of got you engaged in the defense of free speech? Was there something that happened that sort of inspired you to become a passionate defender of free speech?
Well, there was the Bolshevik Revolution, for starters. I am a first generation American. Like my dad grew up in Yugoslavia because his father, fought and lost in the Bolshevik Revolution. We're descended from serfs, and nothing quite like living through all of those horrible things to make you really appreciate American freedoms. My mother's Irish by way of Britain, kind of a different idea, but definitely still a sort of, sense that speech is important, both in the British and American tradition. So I already started with a very strong sort of belief in freedom of speech. Also, because I grew up in a neighborhood where all the kids were also either immigrant, first generation, poor, from a different part of the country. And under that kind of genuine diversity, you need freedom of speech. So like everything seemed to reinforce this, belief in freedom of speech. The thing that really made it a big difference for why I decided to make a career out of it was I was in undergrad and I was a student journalist. And if you want to get radicalized in favor of freedom of speech, as soon as you start being a journalist, as soon as you start being an editor, people will start coming into your office and they'll be like, you have to shut down this columnist, you have to fire this person. And they haven't figured out why yet. They just know they hate that person and they have to go. And you're like, wow, okay, so like all of our democratic freedoms rely on freedom of speech, and freedom of speech relies on this very strong interpretation. I went to law school specializing in First Amendment, and people thought it was kind of crazy because there aren't a lot of jobs in it. And even though I specialized like a mad person, I still got lucky that at the time a new organization, what was then known as the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, was hiring.
Mm-hmm. And that organization, of course, recently was renamed to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. What's changed?
So, we hyper specialized since we were founded in 1999 on free speech and higher ed. And free speech is, of course, of special importance in higher education because you may not know it by the modern academy, but it's supposed to be this wildly open-minded space where you always take seriously the possibility you might be wrong. And even if you've had an argument a million times, you start over again. And that if free speech, dies on campus, that has harms to all of American society, has harms to global society, because it means that the production of ideas can be impinged. So I was pretty happy with focusing on where I thought the most profound problem when it came to freedom of speech was for most of my career. But just like so many other things, around 2014, things started getting so much worse. And there were so many people who were coming to us saying, you do great work on campus, but we really need you off campus as well. And it was only when I saw how bad 2020 was for free speech, and that was the worst year in the United States for free speech in my lifetime, that we decided that we wanted to expand beyond that. And by that point, we were big enough that it sounded like a real possibility. So we announced just on June 6th that we were going to now be the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And I am suitably intimidated by that because I'm trying to raise another, $30 million, but also excited.
Cool. Yeah, I'm excited too. I was there a point when you noticed, was there a point in history when free speech was extremely well supported in America and then a point where things changed? You mentioned 2014.
Yeah.
We can talk about 2020 also, but I mean, I think that, around 2015 is often the year that we pinpoint, and I can pinpoint that in ways too, where things started shifting and what's called, like woke politics started becoming very popular, and it seemed as though there was an opposition to free speech. But what did you observe?
Yeah, I count myself as very lucky to be a kid growing up in the 80s because free speech culture in the United States was still very strong. kids grew up with a rebellious sense of, I listened to, music where it was swear words and edgy comedians and like all this kind of stuff. It was part of, part and parcel of being an American, particularly being an American kid or a young person. And the law was already actually really quite strong in the 1980s, but it continued to get stronger. The First Amendment started getting more strongly interpreted. The first warning sign that something was starting to go wrong was the mid 1990s when I was in college. There was this idea of political correctness. I didn't run into too much of it, so I wasn't super worried about it. But when I got to Stanford for law school, it acted in a lot of ways very much like this sort of upper class, blue-nosed kind of society, that there are acceptable views and not. And even when I worked at the ACLU in 1999, it was like a surprisingly conformist kind of vibe. And you could see in 1999 that given, I still consider myself a liberal, but that part of the definition of being a liberal up until pretty recently was believing in freedom of speech. It was considered basically synonymous with being on the left, but that started to change, particularly on campus, and it trickled down, more from elite campuses on down. I didn't think society was falling for it, though. And I think about watching Comedy Central in, say, like 2007 and being like, okay, like if Sarah Silverman can still make these jokes, even though they're not my cup of tea personally, I'm actually a fairly polite person in real life. That free speech, the state of free speech, is actually pretty good. So how fast it changed from around 2013 to 2015 was you could see that things were shifting and that free speech was starting to become an argument that the left was less comfortable with, and was increasingly sort of taking chunks out of well, that's not really free speech. As frankly, the Democrats became more of a party of highly educated, affluent people. Mm-hmm. But the shift really was so dramatic around 2014, 2015, and then 2020. I just had never seen anything like it. We on a busy year at FIRE, we get 1,000 case submissions from students and faculty across the country. Now, keep in mind that I know there are a lot of schools in the U.S., but there are only about 600 four-year colleges educate about 80% of the students. We got 1,500 in 2020. During a time when most schools were actually shut down. We thought it was going to be super quiet, and it hasn't calmed down since.
Why was that?
What was the explosion about?
Yeah,
it was kind of interesting. After the murder of George Floyd, which I'm a civil liberties person. Like, I thought this was going to be an opportunity to make meaningful on the ground reforms on the way we do policing. All these things would actually prevent something that horrible from happening again. But on campus, what happened was you learned that people had been keeping messages, like text messages from their friends who got admitted to Harvard, where they like quote a rap lyric, and then they're getting them, they're outing them, and then demanding that they get their admittance to these schools revoked, and they did. The same thing happened with professors, like old tweets that they sent that were considered, maybe slightly edgy a couple of years ago, but now we're suddenly not okay. And it was a huge explosion in cases. We were completely overwhelmed, and it was a shame because it seemed to be this very hot ideological. The idea that someone could look at that situation and say, now seems to be the time to settle scores with people I didn't like. And the worst thing that happened, for this was there was this one professor, a very, edgy right-wing professor who I had become friends with after defending him so many times over the years. He got canceled for a tweet that he said. He made a joke based on saying, NASA, whoever the governor of North Carolina was, let my people go, like an old joke about like lockdowns, and that was considered enough to get him fired because apparently like the reference was racist, and he killed himself in the middle of July. And I actually thought if anybody was going to be okay, it was Mike Adams, the name of the professor. And so I with this tidal wave of cases, I took a while to to call him personally, and he was in bad shape. And yeah, so it was 2020 was a scary year.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's interesting in the context of that story, and there's lots of other stories too, that, you know, a lot of people will claim that cancel culture isn't real, or that it's no big deal, and that no one's really being silenced, you know, when people like you or I or anyone else who defends free speech, you know, speaks about how important free speech is and that we need to defend it, people will respond. People say this to me all the time, you know, like, well, they're not really silenced. Like, okay, they were kicked off Twitter, but they can still talk. Or, you know, they were banned from
They're not
Facebook, but
dead.
they,
Yeah.
yeah, like their bank accounts were frozen, but, you know,
I mean, we
like
tried
they're still
to.
walking around in this world. I mean, what do you say to that?
There's what I say to this. I am working like today and hoping to hand this in January with 22-year-old wunderkind Ricky Schlott, absolutely brilliant writer who writes for the New York Post, on a book called Canceling of the American Mind, my very creative follow-up to Coddling of the American Mind. Which I got to lean into these titles I don't totally love.
I mean, that book did very well. It was a good book, so it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I've never liked the title. I love the book. I'm very proud of the book. And it's putting the argument in one place that not only is cancel culture real, compared to other moments in censorship history, it's historic. We are going to be studying what happened right in the last 10 years in 100 years from now. And at this point, people who are saying this isn't really happening, that's a way of saying I just don't have to take you very seriously anymore. Now, I do think there are people who minimize it, who, you know, like you can still have constructive discussion with, but it really was amazing watching people who were saying things like, I think it was Adam Gurry, like he the son of Martin Gurry, and I love Martin Gurry. He said something like, since we could, at that point, there was something like 450 attempts to get professors fired over a relatively short period of time, that under any other circumstance, that would be considered like a problem that was effectively solved. And I'm like, you know nothing about the history of censorship. Like it's important to remember that, like, alien sedition, one of the great scandals in American history, when in 1798 President Adams and his party passed a rule against making fun of essentially the president of the United States and his party. That involved, until recently, we thought that only involved about 14 arrests. It turns out it's more like, it was like 30 something, but still, like that's a bad moment in censorship history. The idea that you have 36 tenured professors getting fired over a relatively short period of time is, as best we can tell, like the nearest thing that we want to compare it to is like McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Well, the best numbers we can find out for McCarthyism was about 100 to 120, 130 professors were fired during that time. A scandal, a bad thing. But we're looking at a much larger number of professors fired, and there isn't a national security threat. There isn't a massive war going on.
Do you think that this is generational? I mean, is there any data that shows that sort of the millennials and younger are more opposed to free speech than older generations?
Unfortunately, yeah. There's a lot of data on that. Now, on the right, there's a free speech is more popular than it used to be on the right. Let's put it that way. Like when I was a kid, there was lots of pushes by people on the religious right, demanding that singers be censored and all this kind of stuff. But that's shifted, and when it comes to freedom of speech, it has powerful positive valence on the right. When it comes to the left, if you're, I'm a big oldie. I'm 47. So basically, people 45 and above who are on the left, like me, we're actually still great on free speech. And the older you get, the better we are on freedom of speech. Below 30, they don't know that much about free speech, but they have some, they've been taught that hate speech is illegal. They have all these misconceptions about it. It's unfortunately that mid group from about 45 to 30, about millennials, where you see this much more negative opinion on freedom of speech.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's because they were going to school at a time when the attitude about free speech started to change from one where it was like the model of higher education in the United States in the 1960s. There was an idea that we shouldn't talk about politics. We are a monastery. We're supposed to be outside of politics and producing, engaging in the battle of ideas with no political axe to grind. That and the fight against that was the free speech movement of the 1960s, and it was a minority point of view, even though already universities leaned decidedly to the left, about 2-1 in terms of professors. But by the 1980s, it was clear that the left had essentially won. And when you're in power, free speech starts to look a little bit more like a burden. I mean, this is a normal dynamic. I mean, like Prince Harry, the fact that he likes to bash like America's like wackadoo free speech. It's like, yes, that's what royals always think. Like people who are related to kings and queens generally don't like freedom of speech. I don't think you understand how quite normal you're being in making fun of people for this. So the more you get, the more you can count on people in power being on your side. You start having motivated reasoning against freedom of speech. So what kept free speech in good shape on campus in the 80s and 90s, and it wasn't in perfect shape. I wrote a long essay for Reason magazine called The Second Great Age of Political Correctness, where I talk a little bit about this. But was the fact that liberals still were really good on free speech. But over time, this long campaign to make free speech, to sort of bring it into question, I think it sort of bled out to the rest of society. And the rest of society, particularly among the millennials, they're adopting what is more a traditional idea of freedom of speech. America had adapted a pretty radical conception of freedom, a really robust one that makes, in my opinion, a lot of sense for a democracy. But what we're seeing is, more people, particularly on the left, particularly millennials, going back to a more kind of like, a more constrained view of free speech.
I wonder, do you think that any of this is connected to movements? Like, so I look at movements like feminism, and I come from a feminist background. I've run actually a feminist website for 10 years, although my perspectives on, my politics and ideologies and on free speech have shifted a lot over the past few years.
Yeah.
I come from the left also. My dad was a Marxist. I identified as a socialist for a really long time. But movements like feminism, like the fat acceptance movement, like animal rights activism, the modern LGBTQ movement, like Antifa, even the left broadly, the modern, like BLM. Do you think that there's something about movements that leads to a kind of censorious approach? It seems to me that all of these movements are deeply opposed to free speech.
Yeah. So I think the fact that the movements became less pro free speech is in part, that narrative of the left becoming powerful, and going through some sort of natural things. I think you can have. I think there has been a powerful freedom movement throughout history, including on the left. There's kind of like, dude, the 60s had a lot of positive versions of this. It was like, dude, do your own thing, man, be your own weird, like which is actually something you can probably tell by the beard I still somewhat subscribe to. But one of the enemies of small L liberalism is ideology. And ideology, I'm reading William Derishowitz's End of Solitude book, and I've got my issues with some of the essays, but he talks about ideology as being the thing that I ascribe to Dostoevsky, talking about, and we put it in a character's mouth, something to the effect of like, you're trying to get rid of your duty to think, that essentially you want something that you can refer back to all the time with great certainty that will always point you to the truth. And so one of the things that was so terrible about the 20th century was it was an age of ideology. And if you have an ideology where there's a sacred dogma, essentially, that cannot be questioned, you are automatically have at least one big exception to free speech, that the dogma cannot be questioned. And unfortunately, I don't know what to do with American universities to a degree, because there is so much ingrained kind of like, well, just accept it. This is our ideology. These are our sacred beliefs. And it's like, well, okay, if it's just a rigid ideology, you don't need to spend all this money on it. You can just write a book and say, these are the following things we believe, so I do think ideology and lack of appreciation for freedom of speech, unfortunately, do tend to go hand in hand.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I've thought about this question a lot because I've been particularly frustrated with the fact that so few feminists support free speech, because, because I came from feminism and because feminists, a certain faction of feminists have faced attacks on their speech. So to me, it's very hypocritical. And I mean, even if that hadn't happened, I think that it's such an important principle to stand up for. But, women like me who have challenged gender identity ideology specifically have been super attacked and silenced and threatened and ostracized and canceled over and over and over again. And so when women who have been in that place and who understand that continue to say, free speech for me, but not for thee, I find it very confusing.
Yeah.
And I guess, sorry, go on. No, go on.
I was just one thing that I feel like every young person needs to understand is that it wasn't a coincidence that the gay rights movement, the women's rights movement, and the civil rights movement all started to really take off in the late 1950s in the United States, because you had two very big things that were going on there. Since FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt were sort of promoting free speech as one of our like typical American values. You also, so you started to have, like, when you look at polling, like the popularity of the idea of freedom of speech really started to increase in the 1950s, which is kind of surprising because we had the Red Scare and that kind of stuff. But, meanwhile, you had this other, partially in response to it, that essentially people should be allowed to say what they think. But you also, from that, you started having a real improvement in the law. And for decades, their activists had tried to have a civil rights movement, going back, to Frederick Douglass, but also going through I.W. Wells and the NAACP. And they got shut down because the free speech culture wasn't very strong and free speech law wasn't very strong. Same thing with the women's rights movement since Seneca Falls. Even the gay rights movement had started to try to sort of make itself into a movement, in the 1950s, and first was stopped. So, like, it breaks my heart that, and I honestly feel like they're intentionally not being told this, that young people don't seem to get that if they care about feminism, if they care about social justice, if they care about gay rights, if they care about any of these things, it was brought to you by freedom of speech.
Right. Yeah. And I think that what you said, I've heard you say this in other places also, that, unfortunately, people tend to argue for free speech when they're weak and then change their tune when they're in power. And, you can see that quite clearly when you look at the people who are advocating against free speech. And what's most odd is that they pretend, or perhaps they believe themselves to be, I'm not sure, that they're the disempowered, that they're the marginalized, that they're the oppressed. And so they have to censor free speech because if they don't, they're somehow under attack, or they're vulnerable, or they're being silenced. And it's so clearly not true, because these are the groups now who seem to dominate institutions and culture and politics, and certainly the media in America.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that really does drive me nuts, and I think it drives a lot of Americans nuts, is that higher education is one of the richest, most influential, powerful institutions in human history. I don't know, that sounds like a lot, but it's true. In terms of, like, when you look at one institution, Harvard, it has $60 billion just sitting in endowment. Half of the Supreme Court, attended there. Like the power that single institution wields, and it likes to talk as if it's actually the friend of the underdog, because it doesn't, it's like it's got this disconnect in its own mind, this conflict that essentially it doesn't want to admit that it is the ultimate manufacturer of privilege, of wealth, of power, and therefore they can't really quite own the fact that they are acting exactly like power usually acts. That essentially it's like, well, now we're going to, and the people who graduate, like a lot of cases, they really do feel, they do seem to think that they're kind of beset and a minority viewpoint. And it's true when you look at this, when you look at the stats for what Americans actually believe, the people who graduate from Harvard are, somewhat out of the curve. But you wouldn't know that, looking at journalism, looking at higher education, looking at, American companies, that this is a very influential group that wants to pretend it's not.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you think that there's actually anything sort of inherent to human beings that makes them want to be censorial, is trying to shut down other people's free speech, or, trying to control what other people are allowed to say or think or have conversations about. Is that somehow inherent to human beings? Is this something we're going to be fighting forever, in other words?
Human beings are natural born censors. That essentially, I can't remember what book it was, but something talking about, the first time we ran into people that we really disagreed with in evolutionary history, it was at the point of a spear. That essentially kind of like the that censorship, as old as the human species. And that's one of the reasons why I call my blog The Eternally Radical Idea, because I always try to point out to people that in every generation, someone stands up to demand that other people be censored. And generally, like, those people are actually winning. The moments when other people stand up and defend free speech as an abstract, that's a tiny chunk of history, and that's a relatively small number of people. We're lucky enough that it's happened, relatively recently, that this has been more accepted, even though it seems to be going somewhat the other way. But we're always going to have to fight the urge to censor. And right now, we're seeing like a major sort of backlash, a lot of skepticism about freedom of speech. And I think in part it's overwhelmingly because we just went through, and we're going through, an absolutely, civilizationally historic shift in media. That essentially, I try to talk about, like, it's like we're 1521 in Europe. The printing press is relatively new. You can really mostly just see the problems that it's causing. Like increases in the witch trials, increases in religious strife, all these negative kind of things. And I feel like, and that was just when you introduced a couple more million people into the global conversation. When you're introducing through social media billions of people immediately into the conversation, it's gonna look crazy, and it's going to be able to tear every person, every idea, every institution down. It just hasn't learned how to build yet. And my hope is that we don't, because we're in this completely like crazy anarchical period because of new media, that we don't tear down the things like freedom of speech, because we can't see that the long game actually means that it will still be of benefit to us to have freedom of speech, even if it's a crazy period that we're going through now.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and I want to talk about the social media issue, because this is like key to this debate nowadays. Of course,
Yeah.
I'm sure people who are familiar with me are tired of listening to me talk about this, but just in case you don't know. So I was banned from Twitter in 2018.
What'd you do?
I said that men aren't women, literally. And I mean, I think
most
that
radioactive thing of the last 10 years has been transgender.
Yeah, and it's sort of
really hard.
Yeah, and at that time there were a lot less people who were saying things like that. Like now it's becoming easier to have those conversations. Way more people are having those conversations. More people are pushing back. So of course people are still being banned on Twitter, but it's less likely that someone's going to be banned on Twitter specifically for that, because there's a lot more pushback now. But at that point, I was one of the few, and I was certainly one of the few feminists and people coming from the left and Canadians who were talking about this. So, I mean, it was definitely partly that phrase, but I think that it was also that I was talking about these things really openly and unapologetically, and I was specifically targeted to be shut down. And we sued and lost. So I'm still permanently banned from Twitter. They won't even respond to my appeals. Like when it sounded like Elon Musk was going to take over, I reappealed and reappealed again. I didn't even get a forum response. It's like they won't even acknowledge me. But I guess I'm curious to know what, in this social media age, like these are platforms that are controlled by corporations and that appear to me to have political and ideological bents. And I mean, on one hand, you can't just let anything fly. But on the other hand, like the censorship is way out of hand. I mean, they banned the president of the United States at the time.
Yeah.
Like, what do we do about this?
Yeah, my at this point, I'm a little more afraid of the cure. That essentially, the fact that some dissenting voices on some of the things related to transgender seems to be somewhat more tolerated than it was, say, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, or 4 years ago. It was a progression that you would expect to see. That essentially you can't keep that kind of rigid orthodoxy enforced for too long. When it comes to kind of like what the way out is, I just think we're so in the middle of it right now that it's hard to actually even figure out where to begin. I think that Twitter has kind of driven a lot of the ruling class of Canada and the US completely crazy. I think that journalists rely on it far, far too much. And I think it's distorting our lives in a surprisingly profound way. So one of the things I'm trying to argue for in Canceling the American Mind is how to raise kids who are savvy about this, how they try to raise kids who are not prone to cancel people, who are harder to cancel, but also to call BS on the way we argue. My take on cancel culture, and the thing we're going to be talking about in Canceling the American Mind, is that it's a way to win arguments without winning arguments. It's part of a rhetorical package of strategies that became very popular on college campuses because it allowed you to win fights with people without ever actually convincing anybody or even making particularly good arguments, because you're allowed to use ad hominems, you're allowed to just declare things taboo, you're allowed to I'm not going to address your argument, but I am going to try to get you fired. And I think that it doesn't get you anywhere. You're no closer to truth if you just, like, if someone makes an argument and then you find out that they tweeted a bad joke 12 years ago, you've gotten rid of the person, but you haven't addressed their argument, and that's to a degree the point. So I'm trying to make an argument for changing the one thing we really can change and would make the world better, the way we argue.
Mm-hmm. And how do we do that?
Step by step. I talk about like the image that I'm using in right now in Canceling the American Mind is Pandora's toolbox. Like essentially like a box that you open up and suddenly, hey, I can win every argument if I just use all these cheap dodges, and make the point that it's kind of like, we could actually be solving problems. A billion new eyes on a problem means we could, if we respected rules of how to get to better ideas, we really could turn this this ridiculous fever swamp quagmire, dumpster fire of social media into something that's positive.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
And hopefully. I mean, do you think that it's a big deal when people are banned from social media? Because again, like this cancel culture, that's no big deal. Stop whining, yada yada yada. People will also be like, it's just Twitter, it's just Instagram, it's just Facebook. So what?
Yeah.
Who cares? That's not real life.
Yeah, no, that I mean, I do think that Dave Chappelle did us a great favor by saying that Twitter isn't a real place, and that's a slap in the face that we all need. But I don't think that people graduating, who have a disproportionate influence on American culture and the world culture, really, from elite institutions that go into journalism, or the ones already there, understand entirely what they're doing. Every time someone gets canceled on Twitter for making an argument, that makes people more skeptical of authority. And I think that right now, when you look at trust in the news media, when you look at trust in experts, it's trust in higher education, like it's collapsed. But what's amazing is kind of like and I sound like a Marxist, but I want to point out, like, it's America's ruling class tends to come from a relatively small small number of schools. And like, so let's take, for example, like COVID. They didn't seem to get that immediately canceling people from Twitter because they speculated on maybe it was a lab leak from the Wuhan lab of novel respiratory viruses that Jon Stewart pointed out in Wuhan. And that was immediately treated as if that could get kicked off. That was misinformation. That was disinformation. And I think they got really wed to kind of the idea, but we know this isn't true. It's like, no, nobody believes you because everyone knows that you didn't have time to actually look into that. Like that essentially they come back with, like, when you come back with this perfect certainty, it's like, well, we know that's not true. It's like, really? Like, we're 100% sure this could not be true at all. And when they made these snap decisions, clearly based more on what they wished was true or ideologically, it undermined trust, even if they're right, even if they're completely right. It turns out that it was the fish market or like whatever. It's like, well, but you're just going to shut me down if you think I might be wrong.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things to come out of COVID and the response to COVID in North America and various Western countries throughout the world is that people have totally lost trust in health authorities, in the government, in the media. I used to trust the Canadian government. I no longer do, not for 1 second. I never even thought about vaccines before in my life. I was like, sure, vaccine, give me one. Now it's like, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of all of these things that I wasn't before, which I think is a good thing, because I think you should be skeptical. But I think that their response really backfired. Their response, which was to try to force people into this, to repeating mantras, trust the science, trust the science, trust the science, without actually allowing anybody to look at the science. Like controlling the media narrative, censoring anybody who questioned that narrative. I think it backfired in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, and here's, to refer back to Martin Gurry, his book, A Revolt of the Public. Yeah, I think the subtitle is something like "End the Crisis of Authority." And what we've created here by having a billion new eyes is that on every opinion, every op-ed, every column, every paper that comes out, is it made a very good point that essentially we've been doing this incredibly dumb thing where we trust pundits, people I know, to have opinions that are valid on everything. And that was a dumb idea to begin with. Like, you have specialists and people who know, but as soon as you actually start having all these many more people on, they're like, wait a second, like, this is crazy. Like, why should I care? What David Brooks thinks about like this particular issue. He's not an expert on that. And it was a pretty thin idea to begin with. So it falls apart pretty easily. But where we're going to head is eventually, and I think it's going to happen before we know it, is you start getting people who, right and left, people are like, you know what? I may not like this person, but they never lie to me. Like, we're going to, hopefully sooner rather than later, but maybe it could be a ways away. There are going to be people who stand up and say, I'm never going to lie to you. I'm always going to be careful in what I say, because the expert class that we currently have, nobody trusts.
No, and I mean, that's a ridiculous position for almost anybody to be in, because these people are essentially forced to have hot takes on such a wide variety of issues that nobody could possibly be an expert on, that many things. But they're also not willing to seem weak. Like, they're not willing to say, I don't know.
Yeah. And I don't know. It's like that's the statement that, as all the smartest people I know are very comfortable saying.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's like, I don't think that it does make you look weak to say that you don't know. I certainly don't think that it makes you look weak to change your mind. I mean, I've changed my mind about a lot of things, and I don't feel embarrassed about that at all. I feel proud of that in many ways, to admit, like, I've looked at this, I've listened to these people, I've talked to these people, I've learned this, and my view has changed. But I think a lot of people are unwilling or really resistant to doing that.
Yeah. And meanwhile, kind of like, one thing that I'm going to be talking about in the book too, but I talk about a lot, is this idea of much maligned on Twitter of free speech culture. I had a debate with Ken White at Reason about it, and his argument is primarily that there are lots of people who use this argument and they're disingenuous and they're, right wingers who don't really mean it. They're just trying to say, that you should. And I don't. I think we both think the other one's argument is kind of incoherent, because freedom of speech came from free speech culture. It came from a philosophy of epistemic humility. I talk about, like, the Enlightenment should have been called the discovery of ignorance. This is not my idea. This is something that someone else said. But that's what it was. It was kind of like all these ideas, all of these intuitions, all these things that our grandmothers told us actually turned out, if you test them, are absolutely not true. And I think that you can have a better life if you practice epistemic humility and a lot of curiosity, and understand that in the grand scheme of things, you don't know all that much. But that's not the way we act. And you can see some of this on the right and the left. And I'm trying to give, like, when I come to sort of concrete examples, of what I mean by that, is always take seriously the possibility you might be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about the ACLU.
Yeah.
Because you obviously were involved with the ACLU a couple of decades ago. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, used to defend free speech. They famously defended the rights of the Nazis to march. And it seems to be a completely different beast nowadays. I mean, they seem to be activists for ideology. They seem to me to be, essentially aligned with the Democratic Party and opposed to anything that doesn't align with Democratic Party lines. And, they certainly seem to have become a trans rights organization, which might sound nice if you don't know any better, but is completely ideological and faith-based from my perspective. What happened?
Well, a lot of people, when we announced that we were, going national, a big focus was like, fire is going to be the new ACLU. And I always try to kind of steer people a little bit away from that, because the ACLU still does free speech work. They actually came out with a lawsuit. They beat us to it, challenging DeSantis's HB 7, House Bill 7, as in its application to universities. And that's one of these divisive concept bills. Probably constitutional in K through 12, even though you can criticize it, definitely not constitutional when it comes to higher ed. And they just filed a lawsuit on that. So, they still do free speech work. But we do try to figure out, we have tried to figure out kind of like how we want to be different, as an institution. And one thing that we're definitely not going to do, and this is to make sure that we don't have 19 practice areas like the ACLU does. Free speech used to be synonymous with the ACLU. Now it's 18 other things, and that's how you drift. But almost more importantly, one thing that's been central to FIRE, and it gets harder every year to maintain this. We try to have a staff that actually votes for different mainline candidates in elections. We actually try to have Republicans and Democrats working side by side. Now, it might be surprising to your reader to find out that, if anything, like, the staff leans decidedly more to the left than to the right. And I get worried about that. I'm like, we need to have conservatives and liberals working in the same organization. And I think that political diversity is a good way to inoculate yourself against the problem of, I talked about it before, ideology.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you have any recommendations in terms of how we can sort of turn people on to free speech. In other words, like, what is free speech good for? Why do we need free speech? Of course, a lot of people who are opposed to free speech think that they're opposed to free speech because they're doing a good thing. They're protecting people from hate speech. They're protecting people from racism. They're protecting people from sexism, transphobia, so on and so forth. I don't believe that to be the case, but I certainly understand why people might think that.
Sure. Yeah. No, the hate speech, the rise of the concept on hate speech, that particularly came from, American campuses, is the greatest PR success for censorship, in my lifetime. And it's amazing that people still have faith that it can work really well. When you see, examples of how it works in Europe, I think are utterly ludicrous, and how it works in Canada, I think is arbitrarily applied, and how it's worked on campuses for 40 years. Shock upon shock, it ends up being the people that the administrators don't like that get in trouble, and the ones they do like don't get in trouble. The sons of professors are fine, and the college conservatives, get lots of hoops to jump through. And I think that it comes from something that sounds nice if you don't think about it too hard, which is essentially, there are racist people, absolutely. There is racism out there, absolutely. There is evil out there, even agree with that. But somehow it's better not to know that someone really thinks that if they really think that. And that to me is grounded in an assumption, which is unquestioned to a large degree, in elitism, that essentially, like, my people know truth and these people are savages and therefore they should shut up. But also, it's not being a good scientist. It's not being a good anthropologist. It's not being a good democratic citizen, because it's like, if they believe this, I should want to know why they think this. I should want to know that they think this, rather than just assuming. So knowing the world as it is one of the most fundamental values of freedom of speech. And one of the most important things about the way the world is what people really think and why. And so, like, the idea that you can get rid of that and be kind of like, well, if you believe the following things, then you should go to jail. It's like, wow. So we're saying what? That we think we will be safer and better off if we know less about the world, less about what our fellow citizens think about what they actually believe. So I think it's a bad idea from the beginning. And the reason why I think it's been able to take off, so well, like this anti-free speech kind of ethos, is that people, they don't think about what it means if they had a belief, that was transgressive. What if some of the things that they thought, for example, were deeply moral, they were not allowed to say? And I think they might start to get it. It would require them to be inauthentic. It would require them to abandon their principles, and it would be ultimately putting someone else in charge of what you're allowed to say, what books you're allowed to read, all of this kind of stuff. So I think that when it comes to, like, where do you start overcoming the arguments for censorship, is with curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I actually think, that's what's so great about Joe Rogan. Like, Joe Rogan is attacked and maligned constantly by liberal media, unfortunately, by progressives, mostly by people who I think don't really listen to his podcast.
Almost exclusively.
Yeah, let's say that. That seems to be my experience. And he is actually, he's like an extremely curious person. Like, he's genuinely interested in learning. He's interested in talking to all sorts of people. He is very good at admitting when he doesn't know. And he's exploring, and that's what makes him such a great interviewer. That's what makes his podcast so good. Him. Right. Yeah, exactly. Because he's not pretending to know everything. When people, I've known people like this in my life, including my father, who pretend to know everything about everything. Like, I remember there was like a certain moment, probably when I was a teenager or maybe a young adult, where I was like, oh, that wasn't true. That was just... My dad told me this when I was a kid and acted as though he was certain of it. Told me as though it was a fact. And so I just believed it my whole life until I was like, oh, he didn't know everything about everything. And now I can't believe anything he says. I mean, not anything, but if he's going to say something to me as though it's the universal truth and the fact, then I'm going to be like, I don't know. I don't know if I trust you anymore. I'm going to have to go look this up.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, like, what people are trying to gain or accomplish by behaving like that really, really backfires on them. And I think it builds trust and to do the opposite, to admit that you're fallible and you don't know everything about everything.
So I don't know as much about the situation in Canada other than being worried. Particularly when I talk to scholars over there. Yeah. I'm always asked if there's a Canadian branch of FIRE, and there isn't. I know there's been a couple organizations trying to do that. What's your impression of where Canada's headed with regards to speech?
Oh, I think it's quite bad. So I haven't lived in Canada for the past year and a half. I self-exiled to Mexico during COVID, and I
Where in
don't think
Mexico?
I'm in Sayulita, which is about an hour away from Puerto Vallarta.
Nice.
Yeah, it is nice. It's definitely different. But I don't think I'll ever live in Canada again. And I've been very concerned over the past year and a half about what the Trudeau government is trying to do in terms of cracking down on so-called hate speech, and on hate speech online. They've proposed and tried to push through legislation to that regard. He is. I just interviewed somebody named John Carpe from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, which is a. Do you know that organization? They're one of the only ones in Canada who are really trying to defend Canadians' constitutional rights, including freedom of expression.
There was someone like I went to law school with who I think was involved in that, but I can't remember her name at the moment.
Oh, okay. They're a great organization. But, I mean, I worry about sounding hyperbolic, but I don't think that I am being hyperbolic. I think that a lot of people in Canada should be more hyperbolic about what's happening, because during COVID, one of the things that the Liberal government did was to impose an ArriveCan app, which means that everybody who's entering Canada has to install this app on their phone and put all of their, information in there. It was originally introduced as a means to supposedly ensure that people are vaccinated when they're entering the country and to make sure that they've tested negative for COVID. And, they're continuing to enforce this despite the fact that the pandemic is over, essentially. And the concern for a lot of people is that it's moving into, and the Trudeau government has talked about introducing a digital ID, which people also have concerns about that turning into some version of a social credit system. But essentially it would allow the government to track everything that you do and to control whether or not you have potentially control whether or not you have access to government services. So there's that, and then there's also this legislation that Trudeau keeps trying to reintroduce under various bills. I think at one point it was Bill C-36, wherein he's trying to crack down on hate speech online by cracking down on platforms like YouTube and Facebook, which would absolutely lead to, I mean, they deny this would be the case, but it would absolutely lead to banning people who criticize the government, essentially. The government determines what hate speech is. They determine hate speech based on their politics and ideologies. People like me would be, banned from the internet.
Right.
And I mean, I have been banned from parts of the internet already.
Yeah, well, that's very worrisome. I think that in the United States, I don't really know how bad it's going to get, and I think that sometimes we can be a little too flippant about it because when you look at the polling, Americans are great on free speech overall, but the people who are the most influential in the United States, the schools they graduate from, and the pretty narrow ideology that you have in American elite law schools, it's gonna be pretty scary. And meanwhile, kind of like, and to be clear, I'm still on the left. Like, I'm concerned about the response on the right as well. So Height and I, in our book Coddling the American Mind, which came out in 2018, we tried to be kind of positive about what the future would look like, but neither of us actually felt particularly positive. And we're both still in the category of like, we think things are probably going to get worse before they get better. I'm mildly more optimistic for some reason right now, but optimism is often punished.
Yeah, well, it's hard to be optimistic. I sort of feel like it's my responsibility to try to be optimistic, but I don't think that I am super optimistic. I'm definitely not optimistic about Canada. I know that when I talk to some people about what's going on in Canada, like when I talk to some Americans about what's going on in Canada, they'll say, oh, well, that's Canada. Like, that's totally different. That'll never happen in America. I'm like, that's a bad approach to have.
Yeah.
Like, if you're not vigilant, then where do you end up? That's what happened in Canada. People trust their government. People trust that the government is they're making decisions in their best interest. They're trying to protect them in various ways. And then you end up in a situation where you can't even enter your own country without having an app on your phone, and where your bank account is being frozen because you supported a protest against Trudeau's policies, which happened. Yeah. I don't know if you followed all that during the truckers convoy, but
I watched a little bit about it. I live in DC, and we had a truckers thing too, but it was a little confused because we didn't actually have lockdown. so like there was like these weird traffic jams happening outside of DC. And when you would actually talk to the truckers, they weren't really clear on what was actually going on. I do think America has a little bit of an inoculation from a lot of the problems I see, because both my parents are European. I spent a lot of time over there. I think a lot of other countries have a sense that there is like a modal, there's a Captain Canada, there's a John Bull, like for Britain, like there's a single kind of person they could be, and that of course if they think of them as a collective we, then well, of course no right-thinking person would think this. America's never really had that, because we were Boston and Richmond and DC, and like it was always a place where it was a split personality country in so many different ways, and that provides us some amount of protection. But unfortunately, that force that often keeps us somewhat, not exactly on course, but not straying too far, it's actually turning to something that's sort of shooting each other apart in a way that's going to end. I don't know. I'm pretty worried about the next 4 or 5 years in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think that we stay vigilant about this kind of thing?
We keep teaching. I think honestly, in a lot of cases, people, reading old books makes a big difference. Yeah. I think that there's an attempt to really shift us into entirely the norms of the present. Yeah. I think one of the things that I do think that sometimes activists are afraid of, that and they won't necessarily put it this way, but that if people look into the past and they read old books, even the offensive ones, they'll start to realize, wait a second, these were smart people and they were wrong about the following 5 things. And I feel very superior about that. But wait a second, am I somehow living in the one age in which we've gotten everything right? Didn't they think that? And that's one of the reasons why I think there's such a focus on no, don't read that stuff. That can produce doubt in the the final ideology that we've somehow always think we figured out.
Are there any particular books that you recommend? I agree with you. I think that one of the most important things that we can do to make sure we don't end up in a real bad place is to pay attention to history. Yeah. But if people are looking to educate themselves about this kind of thing, or maybe help their college age kids out, what would you recommend?
Sure. I mean, I love listening projects. Like when there are projects where they literally will go to different parts of the United States and just hear out where people are coming from without trying to, correct them. But so when it comes, there was a book by Monica Guzman called "I Never Thought of It That Way" that's actually very good on this topic. She's a political liberal, but she has a conservative dad. She's first generation Mexican American, and it's beautiful. And there's lots of books that have tried to do this right, and I think Monica does it really well. Coddling the American Mind, still very proud of it. We try to give a lot of advice about how to parent for anti-fragility, and how to parent in a way that you're not actually accidentally teaching students the habits of anxious and depressed people, which is basically my thesis on this stuff. I actually have a list I have my own running list of books of the month going back for a couple of years now. I read pretty voraciously, and be on the lookout for Canceling the American Mind.
And do you have a publication date?
It's supposed to come out in the fall of 2023. Other things. Can We Take a Joke was a documentary that Fire did back in 2015 about the threats to comedy. We didn't even have a name for cancel culture, so we called it outrage culture.
Okay, I haven't heard of that, so I'll check it out.
It's we did it on a shoestring. The only problem was it was 2015, so it was way too ahead of its time. And then we did a documentary called Mighty Ira about the old head of the ACLU, Ira Glasser, and about how he was a liberal, but he walked the walk on freedom of speech. He was friends with conservatives. He talked with everybody. He had a lively wonderful life. So all these are all things I'd recommend.
Yeah, I did watch that one, and it was a great documentary. I loved that.
Made by our executive vice president Nico Perino, and our two video people, Chris Malbeat and Aaron Reese. They'd never made a movie before, and I couldn't believe how great what they came out with was.
Yeah, it was great. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me today. I just want to ask how people can support your work and support FIRE if they would like to.
Check us out at thefire.org. We're doing amazing work. We're actually doing a giant PR campaign for freedom of speech itself. We have really cool commercials, we have really cool ads, really cool little lessons. Follow us on TikTok. Because one thing that I forgot to say that is really going to distinguish us among groups is that we believe we have great confidence in freedom of speech being a central component of a good, innovative society, and when we will not apologize for believing in free speech, and neither should anyone else.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we got a chance to talk. It was great to meet you online. Hopefully we'll meet in real life at some point in the future.
Well, I do love Mexico. My brother used to live out in Ensenada. It's a great place.
Oh, okay. I've never been there. I love Mexico also. There's so many more places that I want to explore, but yeah, it's a good country. Not without its problems, but anyway,
Well, really nice to meet you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time again, and have a good day.